Good morning, everybody who's joining us from Asia. For those in the US, good afternoon. We have a few those that are interested from Europe, but I'm imagining they're asleep. But they have submitted to us some questions and some comments as well. So we look forward to addressing those here in this webinar. But first, quickly, introductions. My name is Michael Iannini. I'm a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant that specializes in school governance. Joining me is Paul Smith, the founder and CEO of Future Directors Institute. Paul, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Michael says, Paul Smith, based out of New Zealand and Australia, but works all over around the world. Just really, we're all about empowering the next generation of board governors, board directors, and boards themselves, and bringing best practice to the boardroom.
All right, and I want to kind of get really right into the content because I know many of you, this Friday, you probably got a lot on your agenda. I want to keep things moving along. Largely, this is a follow-up webinar to our Building Effective Governance event that we had in Hong Kong. On the Friday night, we met with prospective governors. We got to, hear their concerns about joining boards. We were able to help them understand what to expect when they join those boards. On the full day session, we had representation from self-perpetuating boards, parent-elected boards, and even though these boards, their setups were very diverse, their problems were very similar. And that's a theme that we want to really continue to reinforce, that even though you might see yourself as a very unique organization, you do share very common problems. And therefore, the opportunity to come together in this form of network can be a great learning opportunity. With that said, I want to hand things over to Paul because he's going to address the 9 steps of effective governance that really sums up the learnings on the full day, as well as addresses the main points from those that are logged in today from that workshop so that they can get a quick reinforcement of the content that they were exposed to. So, Paul?
Thanks, Mike. Yes. As I said, it's really what we want to do here is go through this sort of 9 steps, what we call of effective governance, but it's really about building and growing the right team around your boardroom. And there's 3 key elements to this. And actually it's going to sound like it's in reverse, but these are the 3 elements. There's the evaluation side of things, and our Hunter might talk quickly about why we do that, or think about that last. There's the onboarding or orientation of all your new governors as they come through to you, whether it's in a stable fixed time every year or it's throughout the year, depending on how your board is put together. And then obviously there's the actual recruitment and hiring process itself. And what we wanted to help you get out of this is what is the most effective way to find the right candidates, but also on a budget. Most of the boards we're working with don't have a bottomless pit of resources like a big company, a big corporate, who can hire lots of consultants to help them. So we want to give you a process which is really easy to replicate, really easy to follow, and just requires a little bit of time investment to really find the right people. So the first step, even though it's step number 9, and I'll come back to training, is really the evaluation. And it's really important that we start at the end. And I might just hand to Mike, who does a lot of this evaluation work with boards already.
All right. When we focus on evaluation, the whole reason we kind of begin with the end in mind is how are we going to be judged by our community and our stakeholders? Now, when we look at evaluation, there are those things that are prescribed within our articles of association. There are those things that when we look at the accrediting bodies, what they want to hold us to account for, that they have fairly well prescribed as well. When we take a look at those evaluative criteria, they also set the stage for who we need to have on our boards and the way that our boards need to be thinking and working. So by beginning with evaluation first, it really helps set the stage for setting up our governance practices to the most effective medium as possible. One question I note that came in through one of our workshop participants was about what are your top 3 ways for a board to conduct and show evidence of board evaluation in an efficient and effective manner. A continuing or follow-on question to that was, who should board evaluation results be shared with? So to quickly address that, what are the three ways? Well, number one, when we look at our board structure, normally there is a committee that, whether it be a governance committee or a nominations committee, that is formed, that has this role where it's delegated to. So by just having a committee where these discussions are happening would be your first way to evidence the fact that you are evaluating board performance. You just need to make sure it's an agenda item. But now, what does that agenda item look like? Well, the second thing I can tell you that would be the quickest and easiest would be put these three questions on your agenda. The first question is, what are we doing well? Invite your governors to participate in this process. Perhaps you even invite in outside members to address it as well through a form of survey or potentially in an AGM setting as well. Next, what you could do is then you engage in the question of where do we need to improve? Through this, we're collecting feedback in terms of areas of concern that governors and different stakeholders have. Thirdly, what should be our focus moving forward? Now, obviously, we can't address all concerns that community members have, so let's prioritize. And based on what we prioritize, how are we going to take action? Because my third recommendation for you is by identifying those priorities and then involve and including them in future or subsequent agendas, you are demonstrating that you are not only evaluating, but you're following up in terms of your evaluative measures. So that would be the three ways that I would recommend at a minimum that are the quickest, easiest, and cheapest. Additionally to that, there are board health check tools that I use and other consultants use. Even talking with Paul, he has auditing tools for boards that can go very deeply into looking at governance documents, community survey, engagement. So it just really depends on what you want to get. Paul?
Yeah, Michael, can you just repeat those three questions? I'm just going to post them up in the chat function so people can sort of get a bit of a recording of them visually as well. So
sure.
The first one was obviously, what are we doing well? And then the second one was, I just want to hear it in your words again. Where can we improve?
Yeah.
And then the last one,
what should be our focus?
Yeah.
And this doesn't just work for boards, because I know we have quite a few heads of school joining us today. This works for any leadership team, and I recommend it for all teams throughout an organization to address these questions every 3 months.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. And again, it's so important that we start with as I said, in the end in mind. And I want to just go through why it's so important to have a really clearly laid out process. One is obviously in terms of making sure that your stakeholders know that you do have a process that you go through. It's very transparent, and you are open with everybody that you go through the same process every single time, or at least some elements of it all. Boards obviously have limited resources, and if you don't have a formal process, you're not going to get the right candidates, and if you do get candidates, you're not going to get the most out of them. Now, most boards are voluntary, and some have experience in boards, some don't. Those with experience, potentially don't even have the expertise or the time to find, recruit, and hire the right people either. And obviously, the way boards are recruited, it ranges from a mass nominations process to your community, through to the chair or the president sort of tapping a colleague or a peer on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, would you like to join our board?" So the issue with this is you might find yourself with the wrong skills on the board, or not the right skills. You might find that there isn't shared common purpose or shared common values. You might find there's some commitment issues floating around in terms of over-engagement, in terms of operations, or even the board itself, but also under-engagement and a lack of sort of passion. And so you don't really want to waste time and resources by getting this wrong. So the more process you can put in place, the better. And if you have a feedback mechanism built into this process, it makes it much easier as you use it going on, especially if you're a sort of organization that might have high turnover, because you have the parents coming on and there's a bit of a transition. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why. What we want you to get from this process is a clear and repeatable process. something where you can start building what we call your board matrix, which is along the steps in the way, which is a basic skills and gap and needs analysis. And then hopefully we'll leave you with some clear actions that you can take right now, or at least something to prepare yourself for when you actually are starting the process. So step one. Step one is all about purpose and values. So again, it's really about finding what is the common purpose of the board? And I don't mean the school or the organization, I mean the board itself. Why do you exist and what is your role as a group? And then you want to think about what are the common values that you want the board and its members and its governors to adhere to. Do you have a code of conduct as part of your handbook in terms of the behaviors and the values? Do you express that you want all your board to be committed in terms of their time in the boardroom? Do you want them to be open-minded, act with integrity? All these sort of things. What are the sort of things, the guide you want to give to your board in terms of the personal values and attributes that you would like them to demonstrate to you? Also, at a group level, what's your take on diversity? Whether that's age, gender, cultural diversity, a diversity that reflects your community. Obviously, in the boardroom, cognitive diversity is a critical part of that, and that comes from having people with different skills, different backgrounds, and that sort of side of things. So again, having an agreed sort of list of these values, have an agreed purpose that you can communicate, is actually going to really set you up well to act as a sort of filter for the right people. Plus also expressing these things, you'll attract the right sort of people who actually are attracted to those sort of values and that purpose. So as we move on, step two is we start getting a bit more practical. So again, what happens is a lot of boards don't actually have committees out there. If they do, they might have an audit or risk committee or a governance committee around policies and procedures. One of the ones which can be commonly used is a nominations committee, which is actually, they are delegated to run this process, to not only sort of take charge of the process itself and the documentation of the process, but also to actually potentially be in charge of the interviewing and the hiring side of things as well. The great thing about subcommittees is it doesn't just have to be the governors or the directors on the board themselves. You can bring in third-party experts. So the type of people you might be looking for in the nominations committee are marketing and communications people, because essentially you want someone who can help you communicate what's on offer, what you're trying to attract as far and wide. You might want recruitment experts, people who've done this before. Michael, I know you've got some more thoughts on the type of people that might be needed in this sort of committee.
Yeah, interestingly enough, and I don't mean to skip ahead, but one of the questions we received from one of our webinar European audience that is going to be looking at the tape version responds to, we have opted to begin an advisory board. The advisory board should be looking at planning for the future, diversifying, etc. How many people should we have on this board? What kind of profiles should we be looking at? Do we need to remunerate advisory board members? If so, what is the average sum per meeting? The only reason I bring up this question now, Paul, is because you had asked the question about inviting in outside experts, such as recruitment experts. So I think I can kind of address this question together with a composition of a nominations board. I completely agree. We need marketing and communications people on there because we want to get our message out as far as we can. We want to make sure it's clear and understood. We also want to make sure that we're sending that message and channeling it to the people that are fit for our board based on those purposes and the values that we've established early on. Now, when it comes to the question about advisors, outside consultants, yes, there is a role and there is a place for them. Obviously, that Paul and I get a lot of work through that, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we have a permanent seat at that table. We're coming in to help in terms of setup. We're coming in terms of evaluating the progress of that particular committee in regards to the task that they have. Also, various accreditation associations offer a lot of support if they're looking to recruit heads of school. So a nominations committee can actually be critical in that regard. So they might bring in outside parties for that. I'm kind of going on a little bit of a tangent here, because when I look at the purpose of an advisory board, or I don't want to say board either, because it connotates this idea of permanence. When it comes to the nominations committee, yes, depending on how often that committee is engaged in the process of nomination and evaluation, then yeah, there's reason for it to be permanent. But if you're a self-perpetuating board where you're looking at adding people every 5 to 10 years, then I would suggest you don't have a nominations committee, and perhaps the role of evaluation goes into the governance committee. When we look at the purposes of strategic planning, again, strategic planning for an organization should be on a 5 to 10 year window. When we're looking at that particular window, do we need to have a permanent committee for it? I would say no. I'm more happy and comfortable calling it a work group or a task force. In that particular case, it comes back to what we were talking about in terms of the nominations committee. You need people in that committee with that relative expertise within your community. That could be from your management team and from your board. So they're working together in that, in towards that purpose or towards that goal. Now, the voting rights of those members, remuneration, well, your articles of association is where you should really refer to first, because the articles can be quite prescriptive in terms of membership and voting. When we take a look at assembling these committees, working groups, or task forces, we're also looking at, are there ex officio members? Well, ex officio means, effectively through Latin, they're by appointment from the office. And many articles might prescribe which officer needs to be a part of the board or part of that committee, such as the director or head of school, head of finance. Very, very rarely would you see marketing and communications having that role. So they might be invited into an advisory capacity, not necessarily ex officio. Then you have the potential for inviting in consultants. But when we talk about working group and task force, they have a beginning and they have an end. So we're looking for people that can commit to that duration, that have expertise with the stated purpose and scope. And then what we're doing next is we're engaging in a charter process that really establishes that purpose, establishes the roles, decision-making, helps us to identify what a clear end for that task force or working group is. So I kind of went on a small tangent there, Paul, apologize for that. But when we think about the committee, that to me suggests permanence, and the fact that we're regularly looking for governors, in which case we need people constantly focused on that purpose. The role of marketing communications to communicate is important. But if you're a self-perpetuating board and we're looking to recruit members, do you need to have a permanent committee for that? Not necessarily. So that would be largely how I address that one.
Yeah, no, it's great, and you're dead right. Again, it's really, the phrase "horses for courses." The large of it depends. There is no silver bullet to a lot of this stuff, and again, you need it to fit your need. But again, when you set up any sort of committee, task force, or advisory board, you want to be very clear on its role, its responsibilities, and who's going to be there. And the more you can document this stuff, the better it is in terms of future-proofing the sort of like the history and the knowledge within the organization. So, however you set it up, however permanent, however often it meets, and so on and so forth, it might be more intense at some periods and obviously pauses on other ones. How often it refreshes, the best thing to do is document as much as possible, clear roles and responsibilities within any sort of subcommittee or task group or advisory group. Just moving on to step 3, we've already covered the sort of what I would call the human skills, or what some might call the soft skills, the values, the attributes that you want from your governors or your directors. Now it's a case of what do you need from a technical skills point of view, and this is where we talk about a board matrix, which is essentially a basic needs and gap analysis. And essentially, the best way to think about this is to think about where you're looking to be in the medium to long term. It's very hard to look to the super long term now. Excuse me, someone seems to be printing on my printer. That's quite weird. But essentially, you really want to be thinking about the medium term. You know, the role of the board, as we've addressed before, Michael, is essentially that medium to long term viability and sustainability. And it's really, really important that the board is looking towards what it needs to get there. So the way to sort of conduct the sort of needs and the gap analysis is to think, okay, where do we want to be as a school, as an organization in that medium to long term? And where are we right now? And then what do we need? What skills do we need in and around the boardroom to help us get there? And then what have we already got? So for example, you might go, right, part of our strategy is a far deeper and broader, more engagement with the community. Therefore, we have this need for people who are experts in community engagement, in communications. Do we have that in the boardroom? Now, boards often reflect when I do this work with boards, they go, well, we have that within the management team or the executive office. And that's all well and good if they are helping to put strategies together and execute those strategies. But the role of the board is to govern, and that means actually overseeing what's going on. If you don't have that sort of expertise in the room in any sort of format across a number of people, then how can you sort of constructively challenge what's going on, stress test the strategies and the operations and that sort of side of things? Same thing could be said around, okay, we want to develop this amazing culture within the school, or we're developing education programs, whatever it happens to be, or different ways of fundraising. You know, there might be some legal compliance issues, all the different things. What's the long-term strategy? What's the medium-term strategy? What are the needs? And then identifying the gaps in the room. And the great thing is this is something which is relatively agile, but not so agile that you're constantly changing it. But the great thing is, as you go through, and this is why within the graphic you're seeing on screen, there's a linkage to the training and evaluation. That's that feedback mechanism, which is so important. I'm dwelling quite a long time on this board matrix because it's actually the critical part. And going back to what I said about having the right skills in the boardroom, it's really, really easy to just say, you know what, anybody with a bit of experience or anybody who cares about our school, they'll do. The problem is that they're really the people who are going to give you the skills that you need to properly build a strategy, to execute a strategy, to govern the risks of an organization and make sure it's sustainable and viable into the future around that plan that you have for yourselves. So now, obviously you can't have everybody on the board, otherwise your board might end up with 20, 30 people, and that's just ridiculous. Unless of course you have a board, and then it's wonderful. Like that. But essentially what you want to then do when you're doing this process is think about what are the have-tos, what are the must-haves, what are the priorities that we can have, and then what are the things that we'd like to have, or what are things we can cover off using a subcommittee. For example, you might have a fundraising, marketing, admissions subcommittee, or community engagement subcommittee, depending on how much of a priority this is to as well. So that's all part of the board matrix. And the reason I mention subcommittees is to think about when you're having candidates and voluntary people coming to you, if you don't need them on the board, is there a place for them elsewhere? Whether it's involved at sort of subcommittee level or the PTA or another sort of school or organizational council or advisory board, where can you utilize the enthusiasm and the skills of these individuals that are coming to you?
Yeah, I mean,
so
yeah. Paul, if you don't mind me jumping in, the one thing I was going to say about that is even if you're a self-perpetuating board, I think you need to be recruiting year-round, every year, because as we find appropriate candidates, there's always an opportunity to channel them into other avenues within the school. You can channel them into social events that the school is taking on. You can channel them into your open day. You can channel them into your parent-teacher association. You can invite them to be advisors on subcommittees that would be non-voting. So when you think about those subcommittees, there's an opportunity to have people participate in governance, but not necessarily be in a voting role. But we can still leverage their experience and expertise.
That's exactly right. So just moving on to step 4, the sort of position and promote. And essentially this is a case of, right, you've done all the hard work now. You've developed exactly what it is that you need. You have all the skills, both human and technical requirements. You understand from a diversity point of view what you might need. Now you want to put this all together into a role description or position description, which also manages the expectations of potential candidates. So what is the time commitment? How many committees they need to sit on? What are the events they'd have to attend as part of the school community? Be really specific and clear also about how to apply, what are the deadlines, who potentially will be interviewing you. And then you want to put this all onto your website as the go-to place. I think the other part of that, you want to be inspiring. Often role descriptions can come across as very dry and boring, but this is about the future of humanity here. These are our kids. Let's be inspiring about the impact you can have as a governor of this organization. Now, if you're watching this and you don't happen to sit on a school board, you happen to sit on another organization, it's the same thing. Who are you impacting by the work that you're doing? Next is the promotional side of things. And when we talked about this in the recent workshops, Michael, most people said what they do is they email it out to their community. But also on the same time, all of the schools and most of the governors had social media presence. So again, that's another thing you can do. And if you've got a link to a website, it's very easy to, instead of just having a Word document or a PDF, you're linking people back into it. Tap into wider networks. If you're a governor with a decent sort of social media following, or you've got a great whole bunch of local connections on LinkedIn, post it up on there. It's also your responsibility to promote as opposed to putting it through there. Now, the thing is, though, the promotional techniques you use are secondary to the actually making it easy for people to decide whether this is something they want to do or not. And what you'll find sometimes when it goes straight into an application process, when you've got to submit your cover letter and your CV or your resume, is a lot of people are turned off by the time it takes if they haven't done this before. And you might be losing some really good candidates because you're making the application process really long. Also, you might find that people who potentially aren't right for the role, but are ready to go, or they have maybe a potentially overinflated confidence in what you need, they might apply, and you might not be left with the right candidates or the best candidates. So one of the things that we've done in the past, and we talked on the board about, is having some sort of filter, some sort of really quick and easy filter that can help candidates to decide whether they want to apply, and also help you to encourage certain people to apply as well and act as a bit of filter. So a filter you could use is a simple survey tool, which essentially asks a series of questions across some categories. We have an example that we're happy to share with you if you want to contact us later, which asks some questions about their advocacy of the school, their engagement with the community, their qualifications and credentials, and that sort of side of things. And essentially, you can pick and choose what you think are the most important questions. But what it does, the one we've built has this automated report out the back of it, where it actually gives the candidate some traffic light scoring across these candidates and gives them some options. So if they're green lights across the board, then it encourages them to apply. If they're red lights across the board, it encourages them to really have a good think about it and potentially join in with some school activities first to get a better feel for what's going on. And then what you can do if you receive you get the results of these surveys. If you do see someone who's got some really positive results, you can go out to them and say, look, we've got your results. We'd really like you to apply for this position. I think it'd be fantastic. You can, even if you want to, jump straight to interview, but I probably wouldn't do that. So that the filter is a really, really good tool, because the other thing about that, it's a marketing tool as well. It's also a tool that actually allows you to market to a much wider group of people. You can put it up everywhere. You're only asking for people to spend 4 minutes, 5 minutes asking a few questions. So it's a very, very good marketing tool as well as a filter for possible candidates. And then getting the right people coming through. And it's a fantastic engagement tool. So hopefully you've done the position description, you've promoted as much as you possibly can. Again, if you need to spend money by advertising it, that's fine. But again, we're talking about doing this in the budget. That's the only place you probably have to spend money if you wanted to. The next thing is the actual screening and shortlisting. Now, the screening side of things, I don't mean the filter, I mean when you actually have the applications coming through. The first thing here with the nominations committee is to very much agree up front with everybody involved. What is the process? Who does what and when? And make sure there's no surprises, no disagreements, and no upset going forward. You want to have at least a few more than one person reviewing applications coming through. And if you want, and I highly recommend this, have a standard application form rather than a cover letter and CV, because you'll get too much variation of what people mention within that. If you have a standard application form, or at least a list of bullet points of things you want them to respond to, their experience, their engagement with the school, the demonstration of these values, that sort of side of things, you want to really get into their motivations, then these are things you want to know. Then don't leave it open to chance. Have an application form. Really, really simple. It can be a Word document you send out and ask people to fill in. It can be really, really simple. Always fact check across their social media channels, especially LinkedIn if they're on LinkedIn, just to make sure that whatever information you're receiving is matching up. But essentially, these are the ways in which you can screen and shortlist who are the right candidates. Go back to your first principles. What are we looking for? Technical skills, human skills. Does their application respond to these things? And therefore, they're an easy one to move into the shortlist for step 6, which is the interview process. Now, the interview process is the same as the step 5, the screening process. Make sure you have an agreed process up front with everybody. Who does what and when. There's no surprises, there's no disagreements. Again, minimum 2 interviews if you can. Keep them short. Make sure you don't get stuck for questions. Have a sort of a list of pre-agreed ones that you want to ask every candidate. Obviously, you want to make it, as informal as and informal as you'd like. Again, make the interview reflect the style of the board meetings that you have. If you're quite formal, make it a formal interview. If you're quite casual, make it a casual interview. Have a look at the diagnostic tool, the filter tool we mentioned beforehand. If they've done that, test some of their answers in those sort of questions. And again, the more you can have interviews with more people, the easier it is to come to a better decision because you can have some agreement. And if you do have agreement and it's easy, go with it. If it's a hard decision and you're coming down to a couple of candidates for one role, then again, go back to your first principles. And again, what I mean by that is step 1 and step 3 in terms of what are the skills and the human and technical skills that you need? What's the diversity mix we're looking for in the boardroom? Also, are there any HR or legal implications of what you might say to an unsuccessful applicant? You'd be surprised certain rules around that sort of side of things. So again, you're going through a process, and what you've done is hopefully you've attracted far more candidates to you, and you've also allowed people to filter in and out based on your requirements. And then through the shortlisting and the interview process, you've really tested their commitment, their engagement, their skills, and it's made the decision process really, really easy for you. If it's not, and as I said, refer back to first principles. Step 7 is actually a very critical one. A lot of people forget to do. Here we are, we've chosen our candidates, we're putting offers out there for people to join the board, but you forget to do your due diligence on them. And also sometimes candidates forget to do their due diligence on you. Is this really the board I want to join? Is this really the organization I want to join, the school I want to join? Is this really right for me? But for you, reference checking is really important. Making sure that everything they've told you actually plays out in real life. And so the more you can test what they've told you with reference checks, which are really about their character and the work they've done, how they act, how they behave, So if they've been on a board before, don't just ask the chair or fellow directors or fellow governors, but also ask the head of school or the CEO or whoever it was that was reporting to them. How did they operate? Were they confrontational? Were they too quick to say yes, or they never said yes? All this sort of side of things, because their job is to govern others. If they've never been on the board before, then try and find who they've worked with before, or people have worked for them before in some sort of oversight capacity. And again, you're asking these people to sort of nominate these references, but the more you can do to check someone's character and their ability to actually do the job within sort of framework that you've given, the better. Now, this is also the stage around step 6, step 7, when we go back to what we talked about, subcommittees and different tracks for people. You know, you're going through an ongoing recruitment process. If you find people aren't quite right for the board, what about for subcommittees? What about for different groups that you can say within the school? How do you keep that engagement that you've already sort of established with these people ongoing? In the board world, we call it thinking about a bench. You know, it's a bit of a sporty analogy. Here's your bench. Even if there's no home for them, are they someone you might be able to call upon later to make this whole process easier next time?
Paul, if I can interject,
yes.
And building on the due diligence aspect, is due diligence is also something, when we get ready to give those offers and welcome people into the board finally, it's also important to understand we're doing due diligence throughout the process as well. Paul mentioned earlier about a tool that we use for filtering. In that tool, we have questions that range from, you know, how often do you attend school events, to, are you comfortable submitting financial information about yourself, personal financial information? Because some of the countries that I work in, board members actually do have to show that they're not insolvent. They haven't gone through a bankruptcy, that they're not going to pose any sort of risk to the school through any sort of malfeasance. So you'd be surprised, some countries actually have some very strict regulations for governors. I'm not sure if any of our audience today have to endure that type of due diligence. But additionally, too, let's talk about child welfare and protection, security. Are our governors comfortable submitting information to show that they don't have a criminal record? We can ask that in the filter, but then if they've said, yeah, I'm comfortable with that, we've interviewed them, we like them, all right, well, let's hold them to the task. Please submit your criminal record past verifications. That you're verifying you are a criminal, but that you haven't been, so that we can ensure that you're going to be welcomed into our community to that level of trust and degree. So think about due diligence from also beginning with the end in mind. What kind of questions can we ask in advance? Are they going to be comfortable submitting that information and being subjected to this process? We go through the interview. Let's get acquainted and comfortable that, yes, they do meet our board matrix criteria. And now when we go into the due diligence, yeah, we actually have to confirm that, yes, they do actually meet those standards. Sorry for interjecting, but
no, it's perfect. Well, this is again, it's adding a huge amount of value, and the great thing is it's allowed me to segue between the linkages between due diligence, onboarding, or orientation. So the other part of due diligence is, again, as I mentioned, the prospective candidates actually doing the due diligence on you, and what sort of information might they request from you before they make their decision? What sort of documentation? Usually the best thing to have available for them is the governor's handbook, any sort of articles, any sort of information they need to just check off that they are making the right decision to join this board. Past minutes of the board meetings, again, you might need them to send sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's pretty standard in these situations. Again, you can get one of those off the internet if you don't have those already, and just get them to sign it, and then you're giving them access to some potentially sensitive information. But usually what it is, the reason this is a linkage between the onboarding process is essentially when you're bringing new governors into the school, you want to make sure they're hitting the ground running. And again, like due diligence, the onboarding and orientation process is one of the biggest things that's missing usually from voluntary boards. because it's like, okay, you're coming on, you've got a job to do, right, let's go. And there's no time spent extending almost the interview process and the onboard into an onboarding process where you can help new governors get up to speed as quickly as possible. So the way to think about this is like when you joined your school board, what worked for you and what didn't work for you? What was made available? Who were you allowed to meet? Or did you just basically said, here's the first meeting, we'll see you then? So again, like everything else, you want to have a very well documented process that the nominations committee or the board can follow to make sure that your new governors hit the ground running. There is actually a question that's come through on this one, Michael, which I think you've got for me later on. We'll address that in a second. But basically, the way the best process here is, from a process point of view, is make sure you have your legal paperwork lined up in terms of who needs to sign what, the documentation, the policies, the minutes, the handbooks. Have all that up as pre-reading before their first meeting. But on top of that, make sure there's meetings with your fellow governors as well. Who else do they need to meet to start building relationships with people to make sure it's going to be a really great thing? Now, again, it might not be face-to-face meetings. It could be over the phone, whatever it happens to be. Can we lump several new governors together to do this? What you want to do is you want to make sure it's a really inclusive environment. Do we have any online courses, any sort of training that we want our governors to go through? That's something Michael and I can provide. We provide these sort of online training courses for new governors to help them get up to speed. And then after the first meeting and the second meeting, it's not just, okay, we've done that. It's actually having a reflexive process as well, part of the onboarding process to say, okay, let's make sure that after the first meeting or two meetings that all of our new governors have a time to reflect on what's happened and have a chance to share that, probably with the chair. So set up meetings after the first meetings with the chair to say, right, how did it go? What's working, what's not working for you? What do you need from us to help you actually sort of feel more included and be able to get up to speed straight away? And then whatever you learn through this onboarding process, you can feed back into the right orientation process for you for next time as well. The more you can do this and get this right, the easier it becomes to have sort of a really easy to wheel out process. Everything's ready to go. And then your new governors feel like they belong from even before they step into their first board meeting. They're ready to give value and add value straight away. And that's what you want. You've got limited time with the board, so you want them to be using as many minutes of that time as possible, adding value.
So we're getting close to wrapping up here. One thing I want to invite our participants that are joining live, please feel free to start submitting questions based on what you've heard. We're happy to address them coming up here in the next few minutes. As a prelude to that, there was a pre-submitted question that is basically about onboarding. The question is, we have governors joining throughout the year. Do we have to onboard each one individually, or can we onboard once or twice a year? When I reflect on this question too, it comes back to what you were saying, Paul. What kind of resources are out there to where we can differentiate our training for board members, not just those that are joining throughout. And you'll be surprised for those that are watching this webinar. I see boards that always have spots open. And they're hard pressed to add people, and you'll be adding governors in November, February, April. Thinking about that scenario, Paul, what would you suggest?
Oh, look, again, it's sort of like how long's a piece of string type of response. Again, what you want to have, if you are recruiting throughout the year, you do want your board directors to be up to speed, at least in their first and second meetings. So it depends on how many meetings you're having. Maybe you have two onboarding intakes, or in terms of two half years of orientation, and you're giving people sort of 3 to 6 months of orientation time. Again, it really depends on how much resources and how well prepared you are. But if you think about it, if the main part of the orientation is essentially making sure that all the right pre-reading and documentation is available, you can do that at any time. You can have these available at any time for anyone joining the board at any time. Really, it becomes the physical face-to-face time with the fellow directors. And then again, if you've got new board directors joining every single month, then yes, you might not have governors sort of wanting to meet new governors all the time. So you might want to have a bit of a group workshop built into the every quarterly board meeting. So again, it really depends on how well prepared you are, how simple the process is, and how many new people are joining and when. I think if you have, I think constantly joining throughout the year probably means you've got maybe one or two a quarter or every 6 months. Then break it up into sort of that period. You'll find as you do this, it becomes quite simple just to repeat the process over and over again. But make sure that whenever people join, they at least get the documentation, the background reading, and at least have a chance to chat to the chair after at least the first meeting to reflect on how's it all going. Those would be the sort of bare minimums of any sort of process that you want to be doing all the time. And then maybe other stuff in terms of, as well as the online courses or any sort of training you can offer them prior to the meeting.
Now, Paul had mentioned the idea for boards that are continually having people come through the board about looking at it twice yearly. The other scenario is you might not have a lot of turnover, but I would say as a board, you should set aside 2 times per year where you're doing training. And if it's not training new board members, it's basically training current board members. Now, training doesn't necessarily have to be about this is how you do your job. Training can be about team building. Training can be reflection and evaluation. Training can be inviting in a consultant to explore a specific area of governance or the school that governors are interested in getting more involved in. And when I say involved, I don't mean to be overstep into management, but something that they have a keen interest in for the long-term strategic purview of their school. So you should be setting aside 2 times per year to be doing training activities. And again, training is evaluation. Training is working with consultants around a particular issue where you set aside time just for that. So look at 2 days per year where you're getting together. They're your retreats. They're your opportunity to team build. They're your opportunity to check in with each other. So when we look at onboarding, training, and this really kind of wraps up our conversation for the day, what we're looking at doing is setting aside time to have conversations that really focus us on, are we doing what we set out to do? Are we staying true to that purpose and those values that we not only recruited each other for, but for the most part, that is the reason we're on this board, because it impacts our students, it impacts our children. You need to set aside 2 days per year just to have those conversations.
Just one quick point on the training side of things, which I think is really important, given the resources of an organization as well, and given the skills you'll have on the board. Set aside 10 minutes for every agenda to have members of the board, governors of the board who have specific skills, to maybe just run a little 10-minute little overview of their skill. If you think about it, you don't want just one person on the board who is a specialist in everything. You want a few people who can back them up as well, if not everybody. So the more you can utilize the skills within the room to actually help with your training as well as having a retreat. So again, if you're meeting 10 times a year, then have 10 minutes of like somebody, maybe that's every second one, so you're not jamming the agenda, but just have someone who's already within your community on your board. Let's say your marketing person, marketing communication specialist we talked about, or the HR specialist or the legal expert, just giving you like a quick 10-minute overview of how they see things, and just give you a little bit of training. So that's another little extra edge you can do really simply as well. But as Michael says, we're coming to the end of our session now. So what we want to do now, Michael, if that's all right, is just quickly go through what's coming up. Yep.
So I think we have a slide for that. Paul, if you can prompt that one.
I'm just bringing it up now. There we go.
So two of the things I'm really excited about, and Paul and I are really excited about, is every month we get together and we do a wrap up. What are we seeing happening within the terms of school governance? We obviously work with a lot of schools. We also read a lot on governance. We deal with a lot of different partners. Like Paul's got a lot of great information on board software, AI in the boardroom, unconscious biases and stuff that we're always going into conferences. So once a month, we're going to get together. We're going to say, hey, what's exciting you this month about the conversations you've had with clients, other consultants, or that you've seen at a conference. So October 16th is going to be that first one. You don't have to log in for it. We have a YouTube channel that we'll be promoting to you, and every month you'll know where to find it. And that's basically where we're just going to be sharing with you everything that we're learning. Our next big webinar, though, that we do have people register for is going to be with a good friend of mine here in Hong Kong, Alex Gibbs. He's a communications expert for schools. He's going to be helping us understand how to effectively communicate and engage from the boardroom with the community. And with that said, Paul, any final comments or thoughts?
No, it's been fantastic once again to be chatting to you, Michael, and have everybody here and to run through hopefully what is a simple and repeatable process. There's obviously much more depth to these things if you want to. And again, we're always here to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you, everybody. You have a great Friday, great weekend, and we look forward to speaking with you again in a couple of weeks.